747 flying towards South Africa fills with smoke. A fire has erupted in the cargo area, but the plane can't land. It's too far over the Indian Ocean.
The first thought, I think, for many, many South Africans was what was on that plane.
The passengers are choking on toxic fumes.
Request a full emergency, please.
Affirmative, that's Charlie, Charlie.
There's only one way to clear the smoke. The crew must try a rarely used and risky maneuver.
Open the doors.
Open the doors in flight.
Springbok 295, places.
It's a race against time as the plane burns up. It must reach land before it crashes into the sea.
Springbok 295, places. Mayday, Mayday.
On November the 27th, 1987, a South African Airways 747 flies from Taiwan back home to South Africa.
Everything good?
Fine, Captain. Ready to take over?
Yes, thanks.
9 hours into their flight over the Indian Ocean, the main crew returns to their seats, allowing the relief crew to rest. The crew prepares for a scheduled stop on the island of Mauritius. Valerie Lottering has enjoyed her first overseas vacation, joining her husband Corrie while he was on business.
My father was on a business trip, and my mum had gone with for holidays. My dad had actually gone to the east to secure cell phone technology, which was just sort of happening in South Africa at the time.
The plane is a modified 747 known as a combi, short for combination. A passenger plane and a cargo plane in one, it's designed to accommodate flexible quantities of passengers and cargo. The combi has a large cargo area down below, like a regular 747. The combi also has a large cargo area right behind the last row of economy class seats. The cockpit sits one level above the cabin.
You could load from 6 to 12 pallets on the main deck, adjusting the bulkhead for the number of passengers you wanted to carry. And this turned out to be a very worthwhile and useful tool.
Flight 295 is carrying 159 people, as well as 6 large pallets of cargo. Known as the Helderberg, the 747 Combi is a vital member of the South African Airways fleet. It's particularly useful for long-range flying.
For South African Airways, during the days of apartheid, a plane like the Combi helped them in that respect, because they had to fly around the bulge of Africa over the Atlantic.
To protest South Africa's white racist regime, the vast majority of black African states refused to allow South African Airlines to fly over their airspace, causing them to fly longer routes.
There were sanctions, heavy sanctions against South Africa on political, economic and cultural fronts. South Africa was not welcome anywhere credible in the world.
On Flight 295, less than an hour before its stop in Mauritius, the smoke alarm breaks the calm of the cockpit. It's for the cargo area on the main deck, directly behind the passengers. By the time the crew gets to it, the fire is raging.
It's bad.
Shall I get another bottle over there?
Yeah, hurry.
Read out the fire checklist for us, please.
In fire emergencies, the crew follows a standard checklist to extinguish the fire.
The breaker popped as well, huh? We'll check the breaker panel as well.
The fire is burning through the plane's wiring, causing short circuits.
Move as far forward as you can.
But there's a more immediate problem. Passengers are having trouble breathing.
Duct isolation valve switches, open. Pack valve switches, all open. Recirculating fan switches, off.
The fire checklist instructs the pilot to land at the nearest airport, but the closest one is on the island of Mauritius, still more than 300 kilometers away. There's not a lot Captain Ace can do. He asks a member of his flight crew to help fight the cargo fire.
Bring me another bottle.
Captain Ace initiates an emergency descent. He calls the airport on the island of Mauritius, which is on good terms with South Africa. It's just before 4 in the morning when Mauritius Air Traffic Control receives the call.
Mauritius, Springbok 295.
Springbok 295, Mauritius, good morning, go ahead.
Good morning. We have a smoke problem and we're doing emergency descent to level 140.
Confirm you wish to descend to level 140?
Yeah, we've already commenced due to a smoke problem in the airplane.
Do you request a full emergency, please?
Affirmative. That's Charlie.
Captain Ace sounds calm, but he has to find a way of getting rid of the smoke on his plane. Whatever's burning in the cargo hold is producing thick, noxious smoke which is pouring into the cabin. It could be deadly to the passengers.
Your actual position, please. Say again?
Actual position.
Captain Ace is losing power to many of his instruments.
We've lost a lot of electrics. We haven't got anything on the aircraft now.
He's not sure where he is. The airport prepares for an emergency landing, while the crew of the Helderberg follows instructions from another checklist to get rid of the smoke.
Supplementary vent fan switch, off. Recirculating fan switches, on. Smoke condition.
Hold on, I'll check downstairs.
The crew gets more bad news from the cabin. The smoke is getting thicker.
It's worse.
We can't breathe down here.
With the plane approaching an altitude of 4,500 meters, the checklist advises the captain to execute an emergency maneuver that few pilots have ever performed.
We need to open the doors. Repeat, open the doors.
Opening the plane's doors in midair is the only hope for thinning a cloud of smoke that could kill the passengers before the struggling jet can land. As the cabin of South African Airways Flight 295 fills with smoke, there's only one way to save the passengers from the lethal fumes.
Out of flight level 150 for 140.
150 for 140. 150.
The captain begins his emergency descent to 4,500 meters, so the doors can be opened. At 4,500 meters, passengers can breathe the outside air. At that altitude, the difference in pressure between the air inside and outside the cabin is enough to force the cabin air out quickly, but not dangerously. Now the captain must dramatically reduce his airspeed to 370 kilometers an hour, 200 knots. Any faster and the crew won't be able to open the doors.
This is Captain Oy speaking. We're opening 2 of the entry doors to clear smoke from the cabin. Do not panic. You'll be much more comfortable once we complete this procedure.
You just crack the door, and this generates a tremendous amount of airflow through the airplane.
Blazin, Springbok 295. We've opened the doors to see if we can... we should be okay.
Out there!
Close the bloody door. Joe, switch up quickly. Then close the hole on your side.
Smoke is now building in the cockpit, but there's no outside door to open.
Temperature is 22.22 and the QNH is 1018 hectopascals. 1018 over.
The air traffic controller now focuses on giving the captain the information he needs for an emergency landing.
Roger, 1018.
Affirmative. And both runways are available if you wish. And 295, I request pilot's intention.
We'd like to track in on 13.
Confirm runway 13.
Charlie, Charlie.
Affirmative, you're cleared direct to Foxtrot, Foxtrot. You report approaching 50.
Okay.
Captain Ace has one hope. He must make it to the island of Mauritius, 265 kilometers away. The Helderberg continues on its desperate journey.
295, play sense.
But at 4:08 in the morning, a call by the air traffic controller is not returned.
Springbok 295, play sense. Springbok 295, play sense.
With no response from Flight 295 for 36 minutes, Air Traffic Control Mauritius formally declares an emergency. An alert goes out to search and rescue crews. Several aircraft take off from Mauritius and search the dark waters for the missing plane, but find nothing. At the airport in Johannesburg, South African Airways officially declares Flight 295 delayed.
We were supposed to be going away on our annual holiday, so we were all very excited because from picking them up, my parents up from the airport, we were supposed to go off to a 3-week holiday. I think that's maybe the extent of the differences of the emotions, is that you're so anxious and excited for them to come home, and then the absolute devastation of the news, getting the news, you know, that the aircraft has gone missing.
In the afternoon of the next day, a rescue plane spots the first signs of floating aircraft wreckage. Rennie van Zyl, the head of South Africa's Aviation Safety Board, is assigned to the Helderberg case.
A normal investigator will only handle a major accident about once in 20 years in his career. So this was quite a big wake-up and a challenge to us to start running with this investigation in that morning.
8 bodies are found in the water, all suffering from extreme trauma.
It was around about 2 o'clock that we, in fact, were advised that wreckage and an oil slick had been spotted. And it was then quite apparent that the airplane was lost.
The most astonishing thing is that my parents had actually, the night before they had flown, had sorted out their wills, had sorted out their insurances, had sorted out all of their documentation and paperwork before they flew, which was quite amazing. My father made very, very close family friends of ours, our guardians, our godparents, and we were to live with them.
South Africa quickly becomes obsessed with what caused the crash. In the early days, there's very little to examine, only small bits of the plane that are floating on the surface. Contained within that debris, Rennie van Zyl's team discovers 3 wristwatches. The watches give them a probable time of impact.
These wristwatches were in fact part of the baggage, and when examined we were able to find that the one had stopped and 2 others were still running, and the 2 running ones were the exact Taiwanese time, but the stopped one did give us the minute indication of what we could establish as the impact time of the airplane.
The impact time is only 3 minutes after the last communication with the plane. The Helderberg's demise was sudden and dramatic. In the press and in public opinion, it reinforces the idea that something sinister brought the plane down. In the years leading up to the crash, South African Airways offices around the world had been the target of protests.
The South African Airways airline at that particular time was a government body. It was owned by the government. It was the national carrier, but it was also very much perceived to be part of the South African government. So another aspect of this plane crash and another theory that was put around was that there could have been a bomb in the cargo, that in fact we were a target. South Africa, or the SAA plane, was a target of terrorists who had the worst interests of this country at heart.
Experts examine the small bits of wreckage they have, searching for the telltale signs of an explosion: impact cavities, surface pitting, or spatter cavities. Spatter cavities are caused by the white-hot fragments from a high-explosive device striking and melting the light alloys of the aircraft structure. But experts spot no sign of an explosion. And when air traffic control tapes are studied, Van Zyl hears that the crew appeared to be coping with the emergency.
Layson, Springbok 295, we've opened the doors to see if we can... we should be okay.
We've had rumors of atomic bombs, for example, in the airplane. That won't cause the airplane to burn. It will take out the airplane. We did not have that same experience here. This airplane flew for 22 minutes. It's out of the ordinary circumstances. This was not an explosion that took out the airplane.
With just small pieces of the plane to study, investigators are stumped. They don't know what caused the fire or what role it played in the destruction of the plane.
The obvious thing to do was to go and try and retrieve the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, and as much wreckage as we can from the aircraft to establish what really had happened.
The problem is, Van Zyl doesn't even know where to find the underwater wreckage. It could be far from the floating debris. No one is sure exactly where the plane crashed. He turns to the United States looking for help. An American salvage company is hired to find the wreckage and black boxes, but time is running out. The boxes have built-in locating devices called pingers, which run on batteries and will eventually run down.
A driving factor was that the pinger on the data and voice recorders was transmitting, and it only had a 30-day guaranteed shelf life. If we couldn't get out there in 30 days, the chances were that we wouldn't be able to detect it.
By the time the proper equipment can be assembled in the Indian Ocean, only 7 days remain before the batteries and the pingers will die out. Meanwhile, blood tests are performed on the human remains pulled from the debris field. All show traces of soot in their trachea. It's determined that at least 2 of the passengers died from smoke inhalation. Investigators face a disturbing realization. Even as the crew was struggling to land their plane, some of the passengers were already dead. While searching for the black boxes, investigators continue to examine the floating wreckage. Amongst the hundreds of recovered items, a partly melted graphite tennis racket offers a telltale clue about the fire. Graphite only burns at temperatures greater than 600 degrees Celsius. Investigators now know that the fire on the Helderberg was extremely hot. This discovery may explain why a fully charged extinguisher from the front of the plane is recovered with other floating wreckage. Investigators notice a melted piece of cargo netting on the outside of the extinguisher. They determine that the extinguisher is from the passenger cabin, suggesting that as the fire burned, a crew member grabbed the extinguisher and brought it to the cargo area.
A full fire extinguisher in a plane that was brought down by a fire shows that for whatever reason it wasn't discharged because the crew member couldn't access the area because of the heat, or the fact that there was melted metal on the fire extinguisher is further evidence to the intensity of the fire.
Before this accident, in the 20-year history of the 747 Combi, no one had ever died from fire or smoke.
When we heard about a fire in the Helderberg, this was the first time for a wide-body airplane. It was It was news, and because it was so new, and the thought was that we really couldn't have anything like that.
What could have caused such an intense fire on the Helderberg? Was it a wiring problem on the plane, or had the cargo itself somehow started the blaze?
Initially, the investigation, of course, focused on what was the cargo. The fire obviously had originated in the Mayday cargo compartment, so the logical thing is to look what did the waybills indicate was carried in the airplane.
Investigators learned that there were 6 pallets of cargo on board Flight 295. Using master waybills, Van Zyle's team is able to determine that 47,000 kilograms of baggage and cargo was officially on board. Investigators discover that before takeoff, a Taiwanese customs official performed a random inspection of some of the cargo. He found nothing suspicious. More than ever, investigators need to find the rest of the plane and locate the Helderberg's black boxes. But 30 days after the crash, Van Zyle's team gets some very bad news. There's still no signal detected from the black boxes, and they're still not certain exactly where the majority of the wreckage is. So far, the search has cost $1.5 million, and the team has been unable to locate vital evidence. The Helderberg crash is quickly becoming a test of Van Zyle's abilities and his resolve. The investigation reaches a standstill. Van Zyl has failed to discover the cause of the fire or even find the plane's wreckage. If he keeps looking, it'll cost millions more. And the chances of success are getting increasingly remote.
This wasn't just an airplane, this was a Boeing 747. It was the largest airplane of its type. And this was a 747 of South Africa's national airlines. Hundreds of thousands of people who flew the 747 every day at that time were dependent on a satisfactory answer as to whether or not this aircraft was safe and whether or not there were any structural or design deficiencies in the airplane. So the stakes for us were quite large, and the stakes for Mr. Van Zyl as the head of the South African investigation were enormous.
It would have been very, very easy for the South African government to say, the water is too deep, it's too far from Mauritius, we cannot investigate this accident.
Well beneath the grey waves of the Indian Ocean, the wreckage of the Helderberg remains hidden. Now one man, Rennie Van Zyl, must decide whether to spend the money needed to recover the plane's wreckage. But almost 2 months after the Helderberg slammed into the Indian Ocean, no one even knows the precise location of the main wreckage. Van Zyl decides he must try to recover what he can.
Without the wreckage, we'll never know the truth.
So they spent on one investigation what we spent in 6 months of conducting all of our investigations in the United States.
Before investigators can salvage the Helderberg, they must find it. The wreckage lies somewhere very deep underwater. 61 days after the crash of the Helderberg, Van Zyl receives some intriguing news from his team. Sophisticated sonar equipment has detected a large object 4,400 meters underwater on a flat plateau. It could be the Helderberg.
And they presented me with a piece of paper with a lot of black dots of various sizes on it, and they said, that's your wreckage. And my question to them was, how do I know it's the wreckage of the 747? Maybe this is a submarine from the Second World War or something. And the response was just, Rennie, it is it, because we tell you it is the wreckage.
But no one's ever gone that deep to salvage anything, including the Titanic. Van Zyl has no choice. To find out whether the sonar images are in fact the wreckage, he must launch the most expensive part of the investigation, Operation Resolve. A remote-controlled sub called the Gemini will be sent to the ocean floor to videotape what's there. If it is the Helderberg, the Gemini will search for key items, including the black boxes. The problem is that the mini-sub must be attached to the mothership by a flexible fiber optic cable that's almost 7 kilometers long. No cable that long has ever been built.
We needed a 20,000-foot cable. There was no existing cable, so we had to go to a cable manufacturer and get a cable designed and built.
But before the fiber optic cable is assembled, Van Zyl launches a separate investigation into the firefighting capabilities of the Helderberg. He would discover that the very design of the combi may have doomed the flight. Investigators want to know whether the combi was properly designed to protect the passengers on South African Airways Flight 295 from fire.
The smoke should not have entered the combi's cabin.
The American team leader in the investigation, Barry Strauch, goes to Boeing's headquarters in Seattle to find out how the combi was tested for certification in fire prevention. Strauch's team learns that to comply with federal regulations, Boeing's fire tests were conducted by setting a bale of tobacco leaves on fire. When a technician enters the cargo area to fight the demonstration fire, no smoke enters the passenger cabin. The smoke remains localized. The fire is quickly extinguished.
Well, that was in the test conditions that Boeing used to get the airplane approved. But in the reality, as we saw in this accident, it didn't work that way because you didn't have a nice clean fire with fans blowing the smoke towards the ceiling. You had pallets, you had a fire that would have grown considerably before the smoke was generated, and you had plastic sheeting that would provide fuel to the fire, in addition to all the cardboard and packing materials within the pallets themselves.
The combi is designed to prevent smoke from entering the passenger cabin. The air there is kept at a slightly higher pressure than in the cargo area. When the door between the two is opened, the air should flow into the cargo area, keeping the passengers safe. Investigators then conduct their own test. They set a large pallet of tightly packed cargo on fire, mimicking conditions on the Helderberg. The blaze is more intense and the temperature is hotter. Investigators discover that this much hotter flame has a radical impact on the air in the cargo hold. When the cargo door is opened, the smoke now flows into the passenger cabin.
Boeing tests used tobacco leaves in batches of tobacco. In the fire in the Helderberg, it was a very, very different fire than the kind of smoke-generating fire that Boeing used in their tests. Heat would have been generated within the cargo compartment that would have created its own pressure and would have negated the pressure differential between the cargo compartment and the passenger compartment. Without the pressure differential, there would be nothing to restrain the smoke and keep it on the cargo side. And therefore, the smoke would have penetrated into the passenger side, smoke that contained, as we know, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide.
Then investigators discover something potentially more lethal. As the passenger cabin filled with smoke, a checklist instructed the crew to turn on the cabin's recirculating fans. The intention of the checklist is to dissipate the smoke in the passenger cabin after the fire has been extinguished.
Recirculating fan switches on.
But in this case, turning the fans on may have been deadly. Fans draw air from above the cabin's ceiling and from the cargo compartment before recirculating it back to the passengers.
The carbon monoxide levels were extremely high and were fatally high. In fact, the one body, and we have to stress again, he was allocated the seat really below the recirc fan inlet area. That was the highest level. I think we're talking around about 66%. That is not a survivable level at all.
By following their checklist, the crew may have fed toxic gas into the passenger cabin.
And it might very well have been that most of your passengers were asphyxiated before impact.
No checklist for a 747 combi had ever foreseen the Helderberg's simultaneous problems, a cargo fire problem and a cabin smoke problem.
The smoke removal checklist is predicated on the assumption that the fire has been extinguished. In that event, descending to 14,000 feet and opening the cabin door would be the appropriate thing to do. It would get the smoke out of the airplane and enable people to breathe regular air. If the fire hasn't been extinguished, that would have the function of actually increasing the airflow to the fire and increasing the supply of oxygen to the fire. We think that's what happened in this case, that the fire had never been extinguished. And in fact, the crew's attempts to make the situation better may have in fact made the situation worse.
Investigators begin to realize that fighting a fire in the combi's cargo area is much more difficult than previously thought.
If there was a fire in one of these pallets, it was quite likely that by the time the crew was alerted to the fire, it would be too late.
Then the cabin instantly filled up with smoke.
But Van Zyl still doesn't know what caused such a fierce fire. How had the blaze started? And how had it brought the plane down? The answers are still deep under the ocean. It takes months to build the fiber optic cable that's long enough for the Gemini to reach the bottom of the sea and to modify the submarine for this mission.
We had to take the ROV, existing ROV that we had, which was designed for 6,000 feet, and we had to modify it so it would go to 20,000 feet.
Roy Truman's team had to give the sub thicker walls to withstand the enormous pressure it would encounter and modify its cameras for the extreme depth. On September the 23rd, 1988, the Gemini begins its record-breaking journey.
We were hesitant to say that everything would work because we didn't even have time to do sea trials on this, all of this new equipment.
The cable allows technicians at the surface to manipulate the Gemini at 4,400 meters. It also carries video signals from that remarkable depth. It's the first time that video images have been recorded from this deep in the Indian Ocean. Marine biologists are fascinated by the discovery of unique new species.
Some of the stuff that we saw on the seabed was pretty mind-blowing.
Then, 1 year to the day after it disappeared, the Helderberg is found. From a depth of 4,400 meters, the submarine sends back images that could only be the wreckage of South African Airways Flight 295.
There would be lots of luggage just strewn all over the seabed. Massive structures, the wings, tail, huge parts of the cabin split open, and you could see all of the ribs and the wiring, the hydraulic piping. I mean, it was incredible just to see everything that went into a machine spread over an area of about 5-6 square miles. It was incredible.
Van Zyl's expensive gamble is beginning to pay off. Descending to the Helderberg's wreckage is a triumph for him and his team. But just finding the debris isn't nearly enough. A year after the accident, Van Zyl is still hoping for the improbable, the recovery of the cockpit voice recorder.
One of the major aspects we aimed at in Operation Resolve was the recovery of the CVR. We really wanted to know whether the cabin crew reported to the captain that there was an explosion or what was happening at the back.
Hundreds of hours of videotape are recorded. It's exhausting work.
If you can imagine being on a football field with a flashlight that only illuminates a square foot of the football field, and you're looking for an earring one of the football players lost during the game in the dead of night. That's similar to what it's like when we're on the seabed.
Then, at 9 o'clock one morning, something catches the eye of one of the technicians.
Go back for a second. We might have passed.
At long last, the black box is discovered.
There, that's it. That's it right there. Michael, we found it. We found it.
That was a very fulfilling moment to know, fine, what we had aimed for, we have achieved, we're getting it.
It takes a full 5 hours for the Gemini to bring the black box up from the bottom of the sea. The South African media turns the discovery into front-page news. It's now 1989, and the apartheid government is still running the country with an iron fist. Van Zyl makes an unusual decision. He takes the sealed black box to Washington and opens it there.
Because otherwise I would have been accused of having covered up something or left something out or whatever. And we, the FAA and the NTSB guys, all listened to this tape at the same time for the first time.
Tension in the room is high. The cockpit voice recorder should be a tape of the last 30 minutes of the flight, as the crew fought the fire. But the tape turns out to be a major frustration. After a year on the bottom of the ocean, it's difficult to understand anything.
It was the worst time of my life, sitting in the playback room at the NTSB facilities, and you watch the time, and there is absolutely no indication of problems on the tape. And I'm watching the clock. At about 25 minutes, I was really getting very, very anxious.
For 28 minutes, the tape reveals nothing unusual. Then everything changes.
The next minute, of course, the alarm bell goes on the CVR, and we had about a minute's worth of relevant recording on the tape before the tape stopped.
Normally, the black box records the final moments of a flight, but not this time. Instead, investigators are able to listen to the start of the accident before the recording mysteriously stops. It's not what Van Zyl was hoping for, but it gives him crucial new insight into the fire.
Read out the fire checklist for us, please.
14 seconds after the fire alarm goes off, the plane's circuit breakers start to pop.
The breaker popped as well, huh? We'll check the breaker panel as well. Yeah.
Investigators estimate that up to 80 circuits were disabled. The wires to the cockpit voice recorder are destroyed only 81 seconds after the fire alarm first goes off. Van Zyl has not received the key evidence that he hoped for, but the fire is revealed as more violent than previously thought. The recording leaves many questions unanswered, but it does help Van Zyl to arrive at a personal opinion as to why the plane may have crashed.
A lot of things were happening in the cockpit, and we believe that he probably was faced to up to 80 circuit breakers popping in the cockpit at the time. May have made controlling of the aircraft extremely difficult. And the possibility then even of the airplane just gradually descending into the sea. Whether it was a controllable flight, I have my doubts.
I put myself in the cockpit on this thing, and I said, I would have been terrified. Having this, just figuring out what do we do. Did they do the checklist correctly? We'll never know.
But investigators still don't know what triggered the Helderberg fire. The mystery can now only be solved by salvaging parts from the crashed plane.
We realized that what we had to do was just to continue recover as much wreckage as we could from the ocean floor.
Van Zyl's focus is on certain key pieces of the combi's cargo area. They're brought to a hangar and reassembled like a giant jigsaw puzzle. His plan is to reconstruct the section of the cargo area where the fire most likely started. Van Zyl discovers that the cargo area floor is untouched by fire.
So we know that the fire never burned lower than 1 meter off the cargo floor.
But the walls and ceiling at the front of the cargo area reveal severe fire damage. Van Zyl makes a dramatic discovery. The seat of the fire was on the front right pallet of the cargo.
So we were looking at a very localized fire on one pallet.
The front right pallet was mostly filled with computers, protected by polystyrene packaging. Investigators suspect that a fire within the pallet came in contact with the polystyrene packing material, producing gases which accumulated near the ceiling. When the gases became hot enough, they ignited into a flash fire that spread throughout the cargo hold.
Once smoke penetrated the polyethylene sheets, that fire would have been very, very hot.
But even if the packing material had helped spread the blaze, Van Zyl still didn't know why it started. After millions of dollars and more than a year and a half of work, he has to end his investigation.
I would have felt a lot better if we had been in a better position to give more factual information to the board to consider. But that was not to be. And we were not going to fabricate.
But interest in the wreck of the Helderberg doesn't die. Dark rumors circulate about a possible cause of the fire.
It's against this backdrop of a very repressive apartheid government. At that particular time, the first thought, I think, for many, many South Africans was what was on that plane. Was there something in that cargo hold that could have caused that terrible fire? Because planes don't just burst into flames mid-air and crash.
Then a South African government chemist makes a startling discovery, which leads to a controversial new theory. A microscopic iron particle on the nylon netting next to the pallet has a unique profile. The airflow patterns on the iron suggest that it traveled at a very high velocity while in a molten state. The discovery could mean that the fire on the Helderberg was not a flash fire triggered by packing materials.
This was a different kind of fire. This was a fire that had its own oxygen. If you can imagine something like a sparkler, which has fuel and its own oxygen, it was some kind of material similar to a sparkler that we feel was the cause of the fire.
A British fire and explosion analyst examines the exterior skin of the plane above the pallet and comes up with another piece of evidence to support the new theory. The skin on the outside of the plane reached temperatures as high as 300 degrees centigrade.
You must remember that it's very difficult to burn through an airplane skin in flight because the tremendous amount of cooling from the airflow on the outside of the skin.
Dr. David Klatzo is one of numerous experts who question what caused the fire.
It would have involved substances which normally would not have been carried aboard an aircraft, particularly a passenger aircraft. In other words, it could not have been a normal packing material, wood, cardboard, plastic fire. You don't carry the things of that nature which carry their own oxygen, which can produce an accelerated fire, for a number of reasons, one of which they are generally unstable. The second reason is that normal fire extinguishing methods will not put them out.
What could start such a fire? The only dangerous goods listed on the cargo manifest are computer batteries. Some believe the Helderberg must have been carrying cargo that wasn't listed. At the time, South Africa was under an international arms embargo. The country was also fighting a war with Angola.
South Africa didn't have capacity to do everything itself, and there were times when it had to buy from other countries. SAA was seen as a surrogate cargo carrier, that they could somehow, through its commercial airline use, also bring in substances for the South African government, undercover, under protection, no questions asked.
It was not that easy for them to fly a quasi-military airline into different countries and pick up military contraband, which you must remember we were laboring under an arms embargo at the time.
The media fuels the flames of suspicion that the government was using passenger jets to secretly import weapons. Armscor is the corporation responsible for supplying the South African forces with munitions.
At the time, there was a need to produce a better rocket system, a more efficient rocket system for dealing with the air menace in Angola. And the rocketry systems which are used for those purposes have as their propellant, a major component of the propellant is ammonium perchlorate. And that is what I believe was being carried aboard the Helderberg. But it is not the sort of compound you want on an aircraft when you are flying on that aircraft, because it is unstable, it is susceptible to self-ignition by any kind of vibration and violent movement.
The official investigation into the crash does not come to the conclusion that the Helderberg was carrying illegal arms. But the rumors won't go away. And more than 10 years after the crash, the dark theories force a very different South African government to take another look. The Helderberg accident revealed that the 747 Combi was vulnerable in the event of an onboard fire. South African Airways immediately stops using the 747 Combi. American officials take notice.
And the FAA went through and developed some new regulations, but for the weight and everything that was going to have to be added in there did not make it an economically feasible. And so essentially after the Helderberg accident, 747 Combis were not used anymore.
There are tributes and memorials to the 159 victims. But closure does not come easily for the families.
I need an answer for why I was orphaned at 14. And I feel that, as I say, I'm probably touching on hearsay, but there's a lot of evidence that does point to something not being right on that flight, and that the flight was carrying something illicit.
10 years after the Helderberg crash, the new South African government launches a commission to re-examine the accident.
The Truth Commission was tasked with basically uncovering the truth about apartheid atrocities, and one of the areas it was tasked to look at was the role of the SAA in sanctions busting during the 80s, and whether or not the Helderberg was a freak accident or not.
In 1998, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission makes a controversial conclusion. Namely, that nothing that was listed in the cargo manifest could have caused the fire.
And the Truth Commission recommended that there was something untoward about what had happened to the Helderberg.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission exposed the improbabilities of the government version as to what had happened.
If nothing in the cargo inventory caused the fire, what did? And how did it get on board?
The reality, unfortunately, is unless somebody today comes up and says, yes, I did this, or yes, we were responsible for this, and you can prove them not to be involved in a hoax, that will be possibly the only time in which we will really know what had happened and caused and was the source of ignition of the fire.
In its final report, the Commission suggests that the Attorney General's office continue to investigate the accident.
But surprisingly, that has never happened. The ANC-led government hasn't pursued that. And of course, we have to ask ourselves why. And I think that the answer lies in what many people believe, is that it's just going to be too costly.
They don't want to open it for the simple reason that it will be financially disastrous for the airline.
Rennie van Zyl devoted years of his life to solving the mystery of the Helderberg. His inability to definitely prove the cause for the fire does not stop him from seeing the benefit of his investigation.
I believe that we as a team had done the best that we could under extreme challenging conditions and circumstances. What we had done had never been done before. It was pioneering work. The frustration is we could not establish the source of ignition, and we will probably never know.
I believe that those people are still out there that know exactly what happened to that aircraft. I know that their thought processes at the time were our country was at war and they were doing their duty for their country, But I just feel that they should have a heart for the families and bring out that information.
Morning rush hour, Charlotte, North Carolina. Its busy airport is rocked by a massive explosion.
The flames were coming over the fence, just total craziness. Everybody was just running for their lives.
Firefighters rush to one of the airport's main hangars. They confront an inferno.
It was quite a while before we realized a plane had hit the hangar.
A packed commuter flight has plunged to the ground shortly after takeoff. Everyone on board is killed.
We kept scratching our head wondering, okay, this airplane flew 9 times previously and we had no problems.
Investigators uncover a string of errors.
Bill, I have an idea.
And learn that passengers on small planes have actually been in danger for years. It's morning on January the 8th, 2003, in Charlotte, North Carolina. A city of 500,000 wakes. At Charlotte Douglas International Airport, commercial airline pilot Captain Katie Leslie is at work early. Only 25 years old, this Texas native has been flying for Air Midwest for almost 3 years. One of the youngest flight captains at her airline.
Hey, Tom. Have a great flight.
She's a top-rated pilot building her career at one of the fastest-growing airports in the United States. This airport is an important domestic hub for U.S. Airways, with flights to most major cities in the eastern United States. Air Midwest runs a commuter service as U.S. Airways Express. It operates a fleet of Beechcraft 1900D planes, a 19-passenger short-haul commuter plane, and a trusted workhorse in the industry. Today, Captain Leslie is in command of a 1900D on a 30-minute hop to Greenville-Spartanburg Airport in Greer, North Carolina. Her co-pilot is 27-year-old Jonathan Gibbs.
How'd you sleep last night?
Had a dream I was in Miami.
Attention, ladies and gentlemen, this is the final boarding call for Air Midwest Flight 5481 to Greenville-Spartanburg. All passengers wishing to board should make their way to gate.
Among the passengers flying to Greer this morning, 18-year-old Christiana Shepard. Christiana's parents, Doug and Teresa, are Baptist missionaries working in the Portuguese Azores.
Christiana left the 7th of January from the Azores, spent the night in the airport in Boston, and then flew the next morning on the early flight from Boston to Charlotte to Greenville. So she was on her way back to college.
Christiana was very special, and she was one that would come up and give you a hug and say, you know, she'd come for no reason. She would give you a hug and say, Dad, I love you.
At 8 in the morning, Christiana boards her flight. Meanwhile, as part of their standard checklist before takeoff, the crew calculates the weight of all the baggage, passengers, and fuel on the plane. That's to make sure the plane isn't overweight, and the weight is spread evenly. It's a calculation that's made on all commercial aircraft.
So we got a full house back there?
You can count 19 people in the back.
Don't know the bags yet.
Okay.
But baggage handlers raise concerns that the luggage they're loading may be too heavy.
Damn. Captain, how many we gotta take off?
We're figuring it out.
We don't think we're gonna have to take anything off.
Cool. 17,018.
17,120 is our weight, huh?
Yeah, is our max.
So, we're cool.
So, yeah.
Good morning. Welcome aboard U.S. Airways Express service to Greenville, Spartanburg. It's a very short flight, maybe 30 minutes gate to gate, so sit back, relax, and we'll have you there in a few minutes.
Before takeoff, the crew checks the flight controls, including the rudder and elevator, which help control the direction of the plane.
Flight controls, free and correct.
Air Midwest 5481, runway 18 right.
Taxi into position and hold.
Captain Leslie is moments from takeoff. On the runway ahead of them is a Bombardier CRJ ready for departure.
The CRJ sure is a good-looking plane, isn't it?
Yeah, wish I was flying it.
With powerful turbulence released from the CRJ, Captain Leslie must keep a safe distance.
They're gonna blast us with his jet blasts.
Air Midwest 5481, turn right heading 230. Cleared for takeoff.
Set takeoff power, please.
Power is set. 80 knots, cross-check.
At 80 knots, pilots check that key instruments are working. With no signs of trouble, Leslie and Gibbs proceed with their takeoff. To air traffic control, Flight 5481's takeoff roll is perfectly normal.
Gear up.
What?
But without warning, the plane's nose pitches dramatically upward from 7 to a staggering 54 degrees.
Oh, help me! You got it?
The crew struggles to get the nose back down again. Airflow over the top of the wings creates lift. But if the nose keeps rising, air won't flow smoothly over the plane's wings. The plane will lose its lift, stall, and plunge from the sky.
Push the nose down! Oh my God! You have an emergency on Air Midwest 5481?
Alert 3 standby, runway 18 right.
The controller handling Flight 5481 calls for emergency equipment.
Oh my God.
The plane is now 350 meters from the ground. It stalls, rolls to the left, and begins falling from the sky. Captain Leslie pulls on her control column with all her might. If she can't get the plane to climb, she's going to hit the ground. Air traffic controllers watch as a 19-passenger plane plunges towards the Earth. Captain Katie Leslie struggles desperately to get her plane to climb, but it won't respond. The plane heads towards a packed U.S. Airways hangar. The flight was loaded with almost 1,000 kilograms of highly flammable jet fuel just before takeoff. The impact instantly ignites all that fuel. Now the intense fire threatens to engulf the hangar. There are several airplanes and hundreds of people working inside.
Fire signal. Emergency? Is the plane has crashed?
Yes, at the U.S. Air Maintenance ramp, running toward the building, there's a fire.
Code 10, aircraft crash. The south end of runway 36 left. I repeat, confirm
38-year-old Fire Chief Keith Rogers is driving to work when he gets a Code 10 call.
A Code 10 means that there's a confirmed plane crash. Usually, this type of call is a once-in-a-career type of incident.
Cindy Overcash is a firefighter with the Charlotte Fire Department.
You couldn't actually see the hangar from here, but you just saw a huge black plume of smoke. And we knew, something really bad is here.
In the adjacent building, sales director David Isola hears the explosion.
Well, I was sitting at my desk, and I heard this loud boom. And one of the guys came in from next door and said that he just saw an airplane crash. And so I hopped in my truck and drove down to the site.
From 60 meters away, Isola records the opening moments of the tragedy.
There was a lot of smoke, and it was just like hell. It looked just like hell. The flames were coming over the fence, just total craziness. Everybody was just running for their lives.
When Chief Keith Rogers arrives at the scene, he finds himself swimming upstream against a mob in panic.
As I got onto the airport property and got onto the tarmac, the people were exiting the hangar. Those people were running out in front of the fire trucks, the fire cars, so we had to drive with caution. They were getting out of the building as fast as they could, because I think they definitely realized that this was not a drill, this was a real emergency.
And we still weren't sure if we had a plane inside the hangar that had caught on fire, or if the hangar had caught on fire. It was quite a while before we realized a plane had hit the hangar.
Chief Rogers immediately takes command of the scene. He knows that there are aircraft parked inside the flaming hangar. Their fuel tanks threaten to blow.
And our concern was, one, about the people that were on board the aircraft, two, for the people that were working in the hangar, and three, we had to worry about the airplanes that were in for repair. Were those aircraft on fire? So we had a lot of major issues to deal with.
Within minutes, firefighters begin to get the inferno under control. The hope now is that somewhere inside the wreck, survivors are clinging to life.
The main thing probably was on anybody's mind once we realized what we had was survivors.
Chief Rogers sends a line of firefighters led by Cindy Overcash into the heart of the inferno. Cindy Overcash and two of her team make their way into the wreckage, carefully putting out spot fires along the way.
As we walk up on to see the fire and we see what we think are crash test dummies, we thought a plane had blown up inside and blew their training dummies out. And then it dawned on me. That's not a training dummy.
It took them a few minutes to determine exactly what was happening, and once they did that, it was obvious that there were no survivors.
It's a total loss. All 19 passengers, as well as Captain Leslie and First Officer Gibbs, are dead.
At about 8:53 this morning, we had an aircraft accident. It had 19 passengers and 2 crew. There are no survivors.
And we hope that we never have to respond to a situation with such a large loss of life, but that is our job. This is some of the most difficult duty and tasks that a firefighter will ever do in their career.
For medics and rescue workers, the ordeal is over. But for friends and family of the victims, the anguish has just begun.
I was walking through the living room, and I stopped and said, my heart's beating right now just the way it was then, said, "Has Christiana called yet?" She said, "No." I said, "Okay," and I knew then what had happened. I knew. So I went and got the telephone and called the school. He said, "Yes, Mrs. Shepard, we have some sad news." And he told me that the plane had crashed on takeoff. I asked if there were any survivors. He said no. So then I knew I had to go tell Doug, and he was in the garage.
Yeah, it's something you never forget about. I was changing a fluorescent bulb, and Teresa came to the doorway.
How do you say that? What word? You use words every single day. How can you use words to ruin someone's life? But I told him, I said, "Doug, Christiana's plane crashed."
At that moment, my world fell apart.
Now the Shepards and the families of the other 20 victims want to know what caused the deaths of their loved ones. It's been almost 5 hours since Flight 5481 crashed into a hangar in Charlotte, North Carolina. With no survivors to rescue, neither bodies nor airplane parts are moved from where they fell until the arrival of investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board. While medical examiners mark the location of human remains in red, NTSB investigators mark scraps of metal in yellow, looking for clues to help them figure out what happened aboard Flight 5481. Among those assigned to this case, lead investigator Lorinda Ward. This is her first assignment as the lead investigator of a crash. But today, she's not feeling her best.
That day, I was a little bit under the weather. I was fighting off a cold. You have the adrenaline that shoots through your body at the time, and so that actually makes up for when you're not feeling well. And I knew that the other people on my team were experienced, so I felt comfortable going to Charlotte.
At Charlotte Douglas Airport, Ward takes the first steps towards solving this accident.
I checked in with the fire department to make sure that the fires had been put out, and then called a meeting with all the first responders to see what they had noticed when they came to the crash site.
Ward acts fast. Because there are bodies entangled with the wreckage, she declares the crash site a potential biohazard. Investigators who might come in contact with the wreckage must wear protective suits while they examine the wreck and identify the victims' remains.
When we arrived on scene, the accident site did not look like an airplane was there. Due to the fire, the post-crash fire, when you initially walked up to it, it was hard to identify that you had an airplane that could hold 21 people.
While work continues at the crash site,
All right, let's go.
Lorinda Ward and her team look for clues nearby.
We had the folks go shoulder to shoulder on the runway that the accident crew took off on to pick up anything that they saw on the runway to see if it had any relevance to the accident investigation.
Runways must be clear of all debris. The smallest object can become a deadly projectile if it strikes a plane on takeoff. 3 years earlier, a Concorde jet ran over a 40-centimeter strip of scrap metal on a Paris runway. The plane's fuel tank was pierced and caught fire. The aircraft rose to 200 meters before it crashed into a nearby hotel. 109 people on board and 4 people on the ground were killed. At Charlotte Douglas International, investigators scour the area. They find a fuel cap lying dangerously close to the runway.
What do we got?
It could be sucked in and it could damage an engine. The main part would be the damage that it could do to an engine.
The discovery raises an interesting possibility. As Flight 5481 raced down the runway at takeoff, the fuel cap bounced up off the tarmac, struck the engine rotors, and brought Captain Leslie's aircraft crashing to Earth.
This was to be brought back to see if it had any relevance to the accident investigation, whether it came off the airplane itself or if it could have done some type of damage to the airplane.
A closer examination leads Ward and her team to conclude that the fuel cap could not have interfered with the propellers. Investigators discover no other relevant debris on the runway. The runway debris theory is ruled out. Now, NTSB air traffic control investigator Bill English explores another scenario.
When we first heard about the accident, it looked like there might be the possibility that we'd want to look at a wake turbulence encounter.
The wings of a fast-moving jet disturb the air around them, creating a trail of violently swirling air. NASA tests decades earlier had illustrated the power and danger of wake turbulence to other planes.
We had to see, did another airplane depart before it? That's where wake turbulence hazard would come from. And we wanted to look at what kind of airplane departed ahead of it. Larger, heavier airplanes are the more risky wake turbulence creating airplanes.
Bill English examines radar records from the time of the accident. He learns that a much heavier Bombardier regional jet, a CRJ, took off moments before the beach.
The CRJ sure is a good-looking plane, isn't it?
Yeah, wish I was flying it.
The wake turbulence is generated from the wingtips of any airplane. As soon as it starts to lift off the ground, it makes what people sometimes call horizontal tornadoes, vortexes of air that can create hazardous turbulence.
Runway 18 right.
Taxi into position.
Air traffic controllers do have standard procedures for spacing out airplanes so that they have a chance to avoid the wake turbulence or let the wake dissipate.
One year earlier, an American Airlines jet taking off from New York encountered wake turbulence. The plane crashed into a residential neighborhood. 260 people on the plane and 5 people on the ground were killed.
You're gonna blast us with his jet blast.
Air Midwest
5481.
cleared for takeoff.
Air traffic investigator Bill English must now determine if wake turbulence from the CRJ caused Flight 5481 to crash. Bill English studies the flight path of Captain Leslie's plane and finds it consistent with a plane flying into wake turbulence.
A pitch up is not unheard of in a wake turbulence encounter where the airplane will suddenly go nose up and the crew has trouble to counter that and get the nose back where it belongs.
English needs to know how close the Air Midwest flight got to the larger jet. The Charlotte Tower has a sophisticated computer system that tracks the movement of planes while they're still on the ground. The system gave Bill English his answer.
That system had a very rapid update, so we could see exactly where on the runway and at what time the regional jet lifted off compared to when the accident airplane started its roll.
When Bill English plots the precise position of the planes at liftoff, he makes a telling discovery. Even though both planes used the same runway, their paths never crossed.
The RJ started lifting off much farther down the runway than the accident airplane did. And the climb-out angle of the regional jet and the climb-out angle of the accident airplane never intersected. The angle of the accident airplane was very steep. It really had no possibility of intersecting the wake turbulence from the regional jet. So if our airplane lifted off and climbed above the angle of the previous airplane, we knew then that it couldn't possibly be a factor.
The wake vortex theory is ruled out, and Bill English's work is done. Now it's up to Ward and her crew to find clues in the burnt-out wreckage of the plane. Within 2 days, her investigation will reveal a string of errors and faulty assumptions that has been putting tens of thousands of passengers at risk for years. Within hours of the crash, investigators find the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder from Air Midwest Flight 5481. The recorders are designed to withstand temperatures of up to 1100 degrees Celsius. In this crash, parts of the voice recorder had actually melted. The devices are photographed and sent for analysis. Then, amongst the tons of debris on the ground, investigators discover the shredded remains of the elevator control cables. Vital to flight control, these cables link the pilot's control columns to the flight elevator, an aerodynamic panel that helps pilots climb and descend. Turnbuckles keep the cables taut. To climb, pilots pull on the column. The cables pull the elevator up, forcing the nose to rise. To descend, pilots push on the control column. The cables tilt the elevator down, and the nose falls. But as investigators examined the burnt-out cables and turnbuckles on Captain Leslie's plane, already something looks wrong.
They looked unusual. They weren't in like the normal position that you would find them. In this case, we had one adjusted all the way out, and then one adjusted all the way in. So those were set aside for us to look at later.
While the lab work continues, NTSB investigator Stephen Carbone travels to Huntington, Virginia. He interviews mechanics who worked on the plane the day before the crash.
At the time, we had known that it had just come out of a detail check, which is a routine check. And knowing that, we were looking into the possibility that something had been done during the check that needed to be looked at from an investigation point of view.
The cables needed servicing. My guy wrote up a service order, and I put him on it. Don't forget the manual.
Got it.
Every 1,200 flight hours, Air Midwest planes go in for routine maintenance work. This includes adjusting the cables that control the plane's elevator.
In the process of doing this check, he found that the mechanic had found that the cables were out of limits. So he had written up that he was going to check the cable tensions and then adjust them as per the manual.
Everything's right.
The mechanics tell Carbone that the work was checked and stamped for quality assurance.
They believed that the aircraft was properly rigged as per the manual.
At first glance, that belief appears to be right. After maintenance, this Beech aircraft took off and landed 9 times without incident before Captain Leslie took the helm. Investigators turned to the flight data recorder to learn what happened on those flights. The flight data recorder stores data from numerous flights, both before and after the plane's cables were adjusted. No one on any of those flights had encountered any problems with the plane's elevator.
So at the time, we didn't know how that affected the airplane because it had flown 9 times successfully before the accident flight.
Ward also discovers that the crew tested their elevator controls before Flight 5481 took off.
Flight controls, free and correct.
Air Midwest 5481.
Ward and her team dig deeper, looking to discover if the unusual configuration of the elevator cables could have played a role in this crash. What they find strikes at the very heart of what went wrong. Normally, both turnbuckles are almost exactly the same length. But on Captain Leslie's plane, one turnbuckle is noticeably longer than the other. To establish the correct cable tension, mechanics tighten the turnbuckles. But too much tightening of a turnbuckle shortens the cables and cuts the range of motion of the elevator control. The elevator should be able to tilt to a nose-down position of 14 degrees. But their downward range has actually been cut in half to only 7 degrees. The result is deadly. As the flight got underway, the nose pitched up as expected during takeoff.
What?
Push the nose down! Oh my God!
But the reduced range in the elevator made it impossible for the pilots to bring the nose down again.
Due to the adjustment that had been done in the maintenance a few nights earlier, there was nothing that the crew could have done at that time.
Unable to bring the nose down, the pitch of the wings became too pronounced. With no air flowing over the top of the wings, the plane lost its lift and began falling from the sky. The pilot's struggle with the elevator helps explain why Flight 5481 crashed that day. Somehow, the elevator cables were improperly adjusted. The pilots simply could not control the pitch of their airplane. Stephen Carbone wants to know how mechanics had made such a critical mistake.
Yeah, I see that here.
He goes back to the hangar to question the mechanics on duty that night. And this time they tell him a different story.
Most of the guys were just learning the ropes.
The mechanics working on the airline were subcontractors to the contract company. And the mechanics working on the aircraft that night had limited experience on the Beech 1900D. And the person performing the rig was receiving training that night on that specific task.
Once you have the rig pin set, adjust the turnbuckle barrels for more tension in the cable.
Yeah, I see that here.
Adjusting the elevator cables is not a simple process. It's a time-consuming procedure that involves 25 different steps.
Got it. What about the other steps?
Yeah, don't worry about those. Just check the cable tension when you're done, and we're good. That's it.
The quality assurance inspector and the mechanic took it upon themselves to decide which steps to perform because they felt that the steps they were performing were the only ones necessary to get the task done.
The mechanic skipped 9 steps that night. One of those involved manipulating the elevator through its full range of motion. Had the mechanic tried to do that, he would have noticed that the elevator's motion was restricted by cables that had been improperly rigged.
If they had followed the steps as described in the manual, they would have found the problems that had come up.
But there was an inspector supervising the work. Carbone discovers that the inspector was actually the person teaching the mechanics how to do the work.
The problem was that the quality assurance inspector was actually acting as an instructor. So he was taking the mechanic through the process of the job task and teaching him how to do the rig. Well, when you put yourself in that position, you're actually doing the task because even as a teacher, you're performing the task. And then he came in behind himself and then signed off as an inspector what he had done.
When I found out that this mechanic had skipped procedures, I was upset. The procedures that affected our lives, that affected the lives of 21 people, 21 families were destroyed. Because you never get over something like this.
The Shepherds sue the airline. They also demand something unheard of in US aviation, an apology.
They wanted more than just to achieve a just settlement in monetary terms. They had a need to press the issues that humanize and put a face on the people who are the victims of these tragedies.
The Shepherds believe that their best chance of getting an apology is by putting a face to Christiana's name.
So we decided to take this picture and to send it to those people that were involved in the accident, in the investigation, so that Christiana would not be just a number or a seat number or a ticket number or a settlement amount, so that they could actually see that she was a person.
The legal journey began when we determined that we wanted the apology, that we wanted someone to say, we really blew this. We assumed the airline would apologize. We had no idea that airlines don't apologize. If they did something wrong, obviously you should stand up and say, we are so sorry that we messed up in this and we're fixing this.
In this case, the mechanics thought they were doing something that was perfectly reasonable. They thought this was, another day at the job. And then to come to find out that now 21 people have been, killed due to their inadvertent act.
For Lorinda Ward and her team, it looks like they've found the problem. But something still doesn't add up. Why didn't the problem with the plane's faulty rigging surface on any of its previous flights?
We kept scratching our head wondering, okay, this airplane flew 9 times previously and we had no problems. So we're trying to decide, well, what was unusual about this flight?
Ward has to figure out what happened in the hours and minutes before the crash.
And did you notice anything unusual before takeoff?
Well, it was sitting low when it taxied out. It looked heavy.
We had a couple of witnesses that were implying that we had a very heavily loaded airplane. The baggage people said that it was hard to shut the door because they thought bags were going to come out.
Each plane has a maximum weight it can handle before the engines can't get it off the ground. Before takeoff, it's the pilot's job to calculate the onboard weight.
We got a full house back there?
How many we gotta take off? We're figuring it out.
The crew of Flight 5481 did perform that calculation.
Cool, 17018.
We hear them on the CVR going through the numbers to make sure that they'd have their center of gravity within the range for them to take off.
17120 is our weight, huh?
Yeah, is our max.
On any plane, large or small, the weight of cargo and passengers has to be distributed evenly. The balancing point of an airplane is called its center of gravity. For a plane to fly safely, it can neither be too far forward nor too far back or aft.
So, we're cool.
So, yeah.
We don't think we're gonna have to take anything off.
Air Midwest pilots are instructed how to make weight and center of gravity, or CG, calculations. They use average weights to make that calculation, 175 pounds per passenger and 20 pounds per bag.
They knew that they had a very aft CG, but due to using the average weights and average calculations, the paperwork showed them being within the range that they needed to take off.
But Ward needs to know if the plane really was within the proper range of weight and balance to take off.
What we did is we looked at the weights of the actual baggage itself that was on board and then the weight of the passengers and the crew.
Technicians weigh the remains of the burnt luggage from the wreckage site.
Doctor, yes, could you tell me, please, what the last recorded weight of your patient is, please?
And obtain the real weight of passengers on board that day.
212. Thank you.
When all the numbers are in, Ward discovers the real weight of Flight 5481 is 17,700 pounds. some 580 pounds over its maximum takeoff weight.
They would not have been able to take off if they had used actual weights. They would have had to pull either passengers or bags off.
Because of the higher than expected weight of the passengers and baggage on the flight, and the large number of bags stowed in the rear, the airplane was tail heavy. Its center of gravity ever so slightly too far to the rear, which wasn't a problem until the landing gear was raised.
Gear up.
When the gear's weight moved backwards from the nose, it tipped the balance of weight too far back. The pilot's efforts to regain control of the aircraft were futile, crippled by the airplane's defective elevator controls.
When the nose gear moved aft, they lost the ability to control the aircraft because all the weight went back and they had no elevator movement enough to bring the nose back down. And at the height that they were at, they had no recovery.
The passengers and crew of Flight 5481 were doomed the moment the plane left the ground. They had no way of knowing that two unrelated problems would combine to bring down their plane.
This was just a normal routine flight for them, and they did all the pre-flight checks, they did their weight and balance, they did the correct calls, they're on the right runway. It was just another day at the job, and they didn't know that they had these two hidden, latent failures that were waiting for them.
But faulty maintenance and above-average weights weren't the only issues uncovered by Lorinda Ward's investigation.
Hey, you got a sec? I have an idea.
Lorinda Ward suspects she's uncovered problems that didn't just affect this one flight, but that also affected every commuter plane in the air. NTSB investigators say that every plane crash makes flying safer. Flight 5481 was no exception. 14 months after the accident, lead investigator Lorinda Ward and her team file a comprehensive report to ensure the mistakes that killed those aboard Flight 5481 are never repeated. Among Ward's recommendations, that the FAA review its average passenger and baggage weights, an average that had not been revised since 1936. And since studies suggest that Americans and other adults were getting heavier from year to year, Ward suspected that the averages were off.
We made a recommendation to the FAA to have the operators go out and survey their operations both summer and winter time to see how accurate these average weights reflected the actual flying public that was getting onto their airplanes.
After conducting a survey of passengers, the FAA comes to a shocking conclusion. The average weight of adult American passengers was 195 pounds, not 175. The FAA also discovered that the average weight of carry-on luggage was being underestimated by 5 pounds per bag.
We had an average weight that were being used that needed to be updated.
Had these higher average weights been in effect on January the 8th, 2003, Flight 5481 would not have been legal for takeoff. Captain Leslie would have had to remove bags and passengers.
48107, cool, 17018.
Air Midwest pilots now use an average weight of 200 pounds per passenger, which means that their Beechcraft planes can only carry 17 passengers, not 19. But Ward's report goes on to say that even with updated industry averages, there's still room for error. Her report states that flying small aircraft will be safest only when airlines stop using average weight assumptions altogether and calculate the real weight on board before takeoff. New technologies are being developed to allow air carriers to measure actual weight and control balance in real time as the plane is loaded. Knowing the actual weight of passengers and baggage is vital. More and more people are flying on small commuter jets. As the cost of jet fuel soars, the smaller, fuel-efficient planes become more attractive to airlines. In the United States alone, more than 10 million people a year board planes with fewer than 30 seats.
Smaller aircraft are more sensitive to the weight and balance issue than, say, a larger airplane.
In spite of Ward's recommendations and the available technology, almost 70% of small planes on scheduled flights still use average instead of actual weights. For Doug and Teresa Shepard, there is still another danger that threatens to strike again.
If the FAA took a very active role in their regulation, then subcontracting could actually be a plus. The way it's handled today, the mistakes will just continue.
What about the other steps?
Yeah, don't worry about those. Just check the cable tension when you're done, and we're good.
In her report, Ward states that all air carriers need to provide direct oversight to make sure that even subcontracted work is completed correctly.
This investigation was unique to me personally because it was my first launch as an investigator in charge. This was, in my mind, a significant investigation in the fact that we had the 22 safety recommendations that came out from a small accident investigation.
For the Shepards, the NTSB recommendations come too late. But after a lengthy legal battle, Air Midwest does deliver a rare and formal apology for the mistakes that cost 18-year-old Christiana Shepard her life.
My name is Ron Goldman, and my role here today is I will be introducing the public apology, and then I'll have a few remarks. The public apology is, in aviation cases, unprecedented.
We are here today to remember the victims of Flight 5481 and to offer our apologies, our condolences, and sincere sympathy to the surviving family members of the passengers and crew who perished in the January 8th, 2003 crash of Air Midwest Flight number 5481.
The acceptance of accountability suggests that the recommendations made by the safety investigators are not to be taken as a book to throw in a drawer and forget about, but are to be taken seriously. Because if you don't take them seriously, there's going to be public accountability as well as private accountability.
What people should never forget is that as we're going about and doing our job day to day, we need to remember the importance of doing our job. Doesn't matter where we're at on the ladder or the corporate ladder, whether we're at the bottom rung or the top rung, we have responsibilities.
It took a complicated string of errors and miscalculations to bring down Flight 5481. But some believe there was one person who performed admirably that day, Captain Katie Leslie. With an unbalanced plane and faulty controls, Captain Leslie could not have saved the flight. But her final actions may have saved some lives.
You know, she's an unsung hero to me because I don't think many people know about what she did and how she was fighting it and trying to pull the plane away from the hangar. And she actually did. She kept it from really more of a head-on hit into the hangar. Which probably saved countless other people from perishing that day.
It was firefighter Cindy Overcash who found the body of Captain Katie Leslie among the wreckage. To this day, Overcash still feels a special connection to the young pilot.
I don't know, I just felt a kinship. I don't know why. I don't know, you know, it could be as simple as I found her. And I was there when she left this world. I don't know, but I thought about her a lot.
Lorinda Ward's investigation could have ended when she uncovered the errors that caused the crash of Flight 5481. By digging a bit deeper, she made flying safer for millions of people. New Hope, Georgia, April the 4th, 1977.
Hello? My husband called me and he said, honey, we've got some bad weather coming in.
Boys, come on in now. Nasty weather's coming.
One of the worst storms in years is moving across the South. Sadie Hurst rushes her children to safety.
We heard this tremendous noise. When I got to the top of the basement steps to close the door, I saw a red reflection like fire in the door. That's when I saw what was happening.
72 people are killed when a Southern Airways DC-9 falls from the sky.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
May I see your boarding pass, please?
Certainly.
Just down the aisle on the right, sir. Enjoy your flight.
Thank you.
Boarding pass?
81 passengers board Southern Airways Flight 242, a DC-9 bound for Atlanta, Georgia. Many of them are military personnel from nearby bases. Captain Bill McKenzie and First Officer Lyman Keel have been shuttling passengers across the American South all day.
Who's got the lander?
Not me, just the captain.
Ignition, sir.
Pilots regularly exchange tasks on long days like this one. First Officer Lyman Keel will be handling this leg of the flight. He's an experienced Navy pilot who's been with Southern Airways for 4 years. Before their last takeoff, the crew was handed a weather report for the airports along their route.
Looks like you guys got a good one coming.
The DC-9 was introduced in 1965 to fly frequent short flights. Both of its engines are mounted to the rear fuselage rather than the wings. It was designed for takeoff on shorter runways.
We had a 13 landing day, which was a lot of small stops, you know, about 20 or 30-minute legs in between, and it was sort of the tour of the South.
Skies have been smooth all afternoon, but the weather's worsening. The flight crew is prepared for turbulence.
It was raining in Huntsville, and they said, oh, it's going to be some bad weather, don't serve. So we did not serve from Huntsville to Atlanta, which is a very short route, and we were delighted not to be serving.
I was a little surprised that we took off when we did. I really thought we'd taxi out to the end of the runway and hold for a while because the weather looked so bad. But we taxied out and immediately took off.
At 3:54 p.m., the DC-9 takes off into a hard rain. The short hop to Atlanta should take just 25 minutes. As Southern Airways 242 flies away from Huntsville, the National Weather Service tracks weather that's far worse than the pilots expect. Tornadoes are touching down all across the South.
The weather in the Southeast in the United States can be very treacherous. High humidities, high temperatures are a prescription for thunderstorms. And so with all of that kind of moisture in the air and the high convective heating, you're going to have very large thunderstorms that are associated with heavy rains, hail, icing conditions, and extreme winds. And of course, tornadoes that will be spawned from that kind of action.
Huntsville Air Traffic Control has some concerns about the gathering storm.
Southern Airways 242, I'm painting a line of weather which appears to be moderate to possibly heavy precipitation. Starting about 5 miles ahead.
Okay, we're in the rain right now. It doesn't look much heavier than what we're in right now, does it?
It's not a solid mass, but it appears to be a little bit heavier than what you're in right now.
In 1977, most airliners are equipped with the Bendix weather radar. Pilots are trained to avoid regions that appear bright. Where there's light, there's bad weather.
I can't read that. This looks like rain, Bill. What do you think? There's a hole.
There's a hole right there. That's all I see.
The pilots spot a dark area on their radar, a passageway through the storm. They plan to navigate between towering thunderheads over 14,000 meters.
Coming over, we had pretty good radar. I believe right straight ahead. There. The next few miles is probably the best way we can go.
But as they head towards the storm system, they get an ominous report from Memphis Air Traffic Control.
Attention, all aircraft. SIGMET. Tennessee, Southern Louisiana, Mississippi.
SIGMET is short for Significant Meteorological Information. A warning to pilots that dangerous weather is in the region.
Here we go. Hold them, cowboy.
Pilots don't want to be within 50 miles of a lot of those types of thunderstorms for the very reason that the airplane may not be able to handle it, and or the pilots may not be able to control the airplane flying into that kind of activity.
Mackenzie and Keel take a harder look at their weather radar.
It looks heavy. Nothing's going through that.
Mysteriously, the gap the pilots thought they'd spotted no longer seems to exist.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
The storm suddenly gets much worse.
Never heard such loud hail in my life, and in beating on the, sides of the airplane was extremely deafening.
The hail was probably the loudest noise I've ever heard. It sounded like I was in a metal barrel with someone throwing rocks at me.
Please keep your seatbelts fastened. We should be out of this shortly.
Hail the size of baseballs hammers the DC-9, breaking the plane's windshield.
The pilots of Southern 242 had to raise their voices audibly to be heard above the unholy tattoo of this hail, which was buckshotting the airplane. These pilots had never been through anything like this before in their lives.
Which way do we cross here or go out? I don't know how we get through here, Bill.
I know. You're just gonna have to go out.
Yeah, right across that bay.
All clear left, approximately right now. I think we can cut across there.
Mackenzie and Keel desperately seek an escape route from the storm. But as they do, the emergency escalates. The plane loses all electrical power. Without power, Keel must keep the aircraft level without an artificial horizon.
Now the pilots are left to look back out the window and try and orient the airplane with the horizon.
But surrounded by thick cloud, a horizon is difficult to find. It's almost impossible for Lyman Keel to get his bearings.
Southern 242, what's your speed?
Atlanta Air Traffic Control tries to make contact with Southern Airways. They receive no response.
Southern 242, Atlanta, what's your speed?
After I realized that we had a disaster in progress, or something was wrong, I got up and started briefing my passengers.
The flight attendants were very quick in giving us emergency landing instructions. There was not very much time for anyone to start panicking.
Got it back. Got it back, Bill. Got it back. Got it back.
After 36 seconds in the dark, power returns. The instruments come alive and the radio begins working again. Air traffic control finally gets through to Mackenzie and Keel.
Maintain 15,000 if you understand me.
Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
Southern Airways Flight 242 has been instructed to fly at 4,600 meters. But the plane has fallen to almost 4,200 meters.
We're trying to get it up there.
While I was looking out at the front of the left engine, I could see the hail continuing to put more and more dents into the cowling around the engine and into the cone in the center of the engine. and the engine was starting to make sounds like it was quitting.
Okay, 242, we just got our windshield busted. We'll try to get it back up to 15. We're at 14.
Southern 242, say you're at 14 now?
Left engine won't spool.
Our left engine just cut out.
You say you lost an engine and busted a windshield?
Yes, sir.
My God. The other engine's going too.
Got the other engine going too.
Southern 242, say again.
Stand by. We lost both engines.
Both engines are now out. This DC-9 is a glider, and it's falling at 56 feet per second. They're at 14,000 feet. They don't have a lot of time.
Get us a vector to a clear area, Atlanta.
Lyman Keel adjusts his course to navigate his plane out of the storm. Captain Mackenzie must restart the engines, or they'll be forced to make an emergency landing. Without engines, Southern Airways Flight 242 is plummeting from the sky. There's also another dire consequence of the engine failure. Normally, the engines generate electricity for the instruments, radios, and hydraulics. When the engines quit, all of these systems fail.
APU deployed.
The APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit, is a backup power generator. It will provide electricity to the plane, but it will take more than 2 minutes for it to power up.
Once they had finished their instructions and there was simply a waiting period before we landed, we turned to each other and said that we would all get through this together, and we held hands for a moment.
When the second engine quit, I wasn't aware of what was going on around me. I was so focused on trying to figure out a way to save myself. I knew that sometimes the tail breaks off in an accident, and I felt the further back I could get, the better.
There we go.
After 2 minutes without systems, the Auxiliary Power Unit finally kicks in. The pilots may not have engines, but at least they now have power.
We lost both engines. How about getting the vector to the nearest place?
Captain Mackenzie needs directions to an airport. The flight can only stay airborne for another 6 minutes. Dorbin's Air Force Base is 32 kilometers away. It has a runway that's long enough for a DC-9. It also has full emergency services.
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100.
Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
This Dobbins weather, Bill. How far is it? How far is it?
Lyman Keel knows Dorbin's Air Force Base intimately. He trained there, and it's now his home base as a Navy Reserve pilot. He's landed there frequently.
Declare an emergency, Bill.
Right now, Keel's familiarity with Dorbin's is the only advantage this crew has. Less than 16 kilometers away lies the town of New Hope, Georgia. Sadie Hurst sees no signs of an advancing storm.
It was an absolutely beautiful day. The children were playing outside. They were riding their bicycles up and down the driveway.
Hello? Hey, you.
My husband worked in Atlanta, and he kept his radio on the Huntsville radio station. And he called me, and he said, honey, we've got some bad weather coming in. He said, you need to get the kids in.
Boys, come on in now. Nasty weather's coming. Come in now. All right, flashlights and batteries, Stephen.
Ordinarily, tornadoes come with bad weather, you know, dark clouds and rain and hail. But we didn't see any of that.
Southern Airways 242 finally breaks through the storm clouds into clear skies. The plane descends steadily through 2,100 meters.
Get those engines started.
Once the engines failed, the workload in the cockpit increased substantially. In this particular instance, the first officer was the, quote, pilot flying. He was the one that was actually manipulating the flight controls and maneuvering the airplane. The captain, on the other hand, was now running checklist and trying to troubleshoot.
Listen, we lost both engines, and I can't tell you the implications of this. We only got 2 engines. And how far is Dobbins now?
Southern 242, 19 miles. Do you have 1 engine running now?
Negative. No engines.
I didn't know what was wrong, but I could tell something was wrong. I went and opened the cockpit door simply to tell them we're ready for whatever.
Just don't stall this thing out.
No, I won't.
Bill, what's going on?
Not now, Kathy. Sit down.
You could tell they were afraid. I understood that they were afraid just for the sound of their voice. So I understood that there was something very dangerous going on, but I had no idea what.
Down to only 1,400 meters, the plane is still 27 kilometers from Dobbins Air Force Base.
Ask him if there's anything between here and Dobbins.
What?
Ask him if there's anything between here and Dobbins.
Is there an airport between our position and Dobbins?
Southern 242, no, sir. Closest airport is Dobbins.
First Officer Lyman Keel doesn't think he can get the DC-9 as far as Dobbins Air Force Base. He's lost too much altitude.
I doubt we're going to make it, but we're trying everything to get something started.
Roger. Well, there is Cartersville. You're about 10 miles south of Cartersville, 15 miles west of Dobbins.
Keel needs a closer airport. Cartersville seems like a good choice.
We'll take a vector to that, yes. We'll have to go there.
Can you give us a vector to Cartersville?
All right, turn left, heading 360. We'll be direct vector to Cartersville.
Air traffic controllers in Atlanta see no other options. They direct Flight 242 to Cartersville Airport. As the pilots seek out an airport, the flight attendants still don't know what type of landing to prepare for.
They wouldn't talk to me. When I looked in the door, the whole windshield was cracked. So what do we do?
I think we've lost both the engines.
I thought so.
Okay. Kathy, have you briefed all your passengers?
Mm-hmm.
I realized I was in an emergency situation and I felt like I was going to die, but I decided I would do everything I could to try to help my chances. I had previously collected some blankets and pillows and had gotten my leather jacket off the overhead rack. And I arranged those to make a nest as much as I could for myself.
With tornadoes in the forecast, the community of New Hope is braced for a different type of danger.
After a couple hours of playing outside, my mother called us in to come in because there was bad weather coming our way. We came into the house, and Mother had told us about what was going on, and she said that we need to get downstairs to prepare for the bad weather that was coming.
Southern Airways Flight 242 has lost too much altitude. The pilots come to the frightening conclusion that at the rate they're falling, they can't make it to Cartersville. They must prepare to land now.
I'm picking out a clear field.
Bill, you have to find me a highway.
Let's get the next clear open field.
No, Bill.
See a highway over there. No cars.
Right there. Is that straight?
No.
We'll have to take it.
Lyman Keel decides to bring the plane down onto a rural highway, Georgia State Highway 92. Captain Bill McKenzie radios Atlanta Air Traffic Control with the bad news.
We're putting it on the highway. We're down to nothing.
The clock runs out on Southern Airways 242.
Sweet Jesus.
With no engines, First Officer Lyman Keel lines up the aircraft for an emergency landing on the highway that runs through New Hope, Georgia.
In the last minute, we did a steep left bank in which we were able to see the pine trees that were very close to the aircraft.
Flaps.
They're down to 50.
Oh, God, Bill. I hope we can do it.
Without training on how to land a DC-9 with no engines, First Officer Lyman Keel's attempt is entirely improvised.
Lyman Keel is a young man who has just come back from the proving ground of Southeast Asia, where he was a naval aviator. He learned the niceties of landing on a rolling, pitching aircraft carrier in the South China Sea in the middle of the night. What he was confronted with right now was even a greater test, the greatest test he had ever confronted in his life as an airman.
I'm gonna land right over that guy.
There's a car ahead.
I got it. I got it now. I got it.
Brace for impact!
The Southern Airways flight touches down on State Highway 92.
When the aircraft touched down, the first touchdown was very, very nice. It was smooth. It seemed like it was going to work and everything was going to turn out okay. And then it immediately bounced back up in the air and slammed down.
Each bump that we made seemed to be harder and louder than the previous one.
The plane smashes into New Hope.
Before the plane completely stopped moving, there was fire blowing through the cabin. I felt my face burning, even though I tried to cover it with my leather jacket.
We heard this tremendous noise.
Large sections of Southern Airways 242 litter the entire length of New Hope.
Come on, damn it. I got my seatbelt loose after a few tries and turned toward the rear of the airplane, and I saw a spot of light. I got up and ran for that light. I could not believe I was alive. I just could not believe it.
Where I found myself after we woke up was sort of indescribable. I was sitting by the front entry door. We have a coat closet that was adjacent to it and the back wall that the jump seat strapped to. All three of those walls had collapsed and rolled into like a little triangle ball area. And there was just enough room for me inside. And I could see a crack of light, and I thought, I'm going through that crack of light, come hell or high water.
In the very next instant, as if I had just blinked my eyes, instead of seeing the carpet between my feet, I suddenly was looking at blue sky above me. I realized I was lying flat on my back in the dirt. Everything to the left of me was flaming wreckage. I didn't even recognize it as being the plane that I had just been thrown out of. I thought it was maybe a house that we had hit.
Stewardess Sandy Pearl also escapes safely. She's able to help others. Survivors flee the flaming wreckage.
When I got to the top of the basement steps to close the door, I saw a red reflection like fire in the door. That's when I saw what was happening. I saw smoke and fire. And the people that were coming toward me, they weren't screaming, they weren't yelling, they were quiet.
Everything was on fire, and I could see people running toward a house.
I need to use your phone.
I wanted to call the local people or Southern or somebody and say, we've just landed somewhere and we need help.
It just became a blur. They just kept coming.
You help her.
I got back to the kitchen and I was just circled by people. They knew they were in a house, and I guess they felt safe, and they needed somebody to help them. I was still frantic. I was still trying to move as quickly as possible and do as much as I could at the time.
And I'll remember to the day I died just staring there at the trees burning and pine trees burning and pieces of aircraft. It was so unreal. I've never seen anything like it and never want to see anything like that again.
"72 people, including pilots Lyman Keel and Bill McKenzie, die in the crash of Southern Airways Flight 242. Investigators would soon uncover a tragic series of miscues and coincidences that caused the plane to crash.
Southern Flight 242 crashed after the DC-9 jet lost power in both engines. The plane had just flown through a violent hailstorm on a flight from Huntsville, Alabama to Atlanta.
I saw the plane as it came veering down, hit the treetops. We thought it was a tornado at first. Vehicles, people that was in this grocery store yard and vehicles, it actually hit them.
A family of 7 is killed instantly when the plane hit their car.
They were just leaving the store about the time that the flight tried to land on the highway. And then, of course, I think they hit the gas pumps and they exploded and everything around was on fire. And like I said, they were in the car and perished during the explosion and fire.
Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrive within hours of the accident. This is the second major blow to Southern Airways' safety record. In 1970, Flight 932, carrying the Marshall University football team, crashed in West Virginia. Everyone on board was killed.
There are always many questions that investigators have to find answers to. The 2 primary questions that needed to be answered by the board were what were the weather conditions and what caused both engines on a 2-engine airplane to flame out that resulted in the pilots having to make an emergency landing on a highway in a small town.
The storm that Flight 242 flew into was a monster. Why had a crew so familiar with weather in the South flown headfirst into it?
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
Investigators listened to the cockpit voice recorder for any clues about the decisions made by the crew as they were entering the thunderstorm.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
They learned that the pilots relied heavily on their weather radar as they approached the storm. But it appears to have deceived them.
All clear left, approximately right now. I think we can cut across there.
One of the limitations of the radar that the crew of Flight 242 was using is signal attenuation. That is that the beam that is projected from the radar unit out to look at the weather and return is diffused, so that the picture that is depicted in the cockpit that the crew is looking at may not be accurate.
Weather radar sends out radio waves. Those waves bounce off storm clouds ahead and return to the aircraft. But if precipitation is extremely intense, the radio waves can be deflected away. The radar unit might then interpret the lack of returning waves as a clear path ahead.
Those inaccuracies are hard to decipher, and if the crew is depending solely or very intently on the radar to guide them through the precipitation, they may be making decisions that aren't based on accurate information.
The storm that entangled Southern Airways 242 is one of the worst to hit the United States in 3 years. The crew didn't encounter a tornado, but it was battered by torrential rain and heavy hail.
Which way do we cross here or go out? I don't know how we get through here, Bill.
What Keel and Mackenzie read as a clear area ahead was in fact the heaviest part of the storm. They flew straight for it.
The other engine's going too.
Got the other engine going too.
Southern 242, say again.
Stand by. We lost both engines.
Once inside the storm, the DC-9's engines failed. But a turbofan engine is designed to ingest huge amounts of rain and even hail. Precipitation alone should not have shut them down. Investigators study what's left of the DC-9's engines for clues. They need to know if some mechanical failure caused both engines to fail inside the storm.
Well, initially I was puzzled as to how the engines could be involved in the cause of this accident, but I was very anxious to get there to see the engines myself to find out if there was any sort of visible failure in the engines.
Pratt & Whitney, the manufacturer of the engines, assigns Al Weaver to advise the NTSB investigation. The engines are moved to Atlanta Airport for a closer inspection.
And when they lifted the engines up in the vertical direction in the hangar, I could hear the tinkling and pieces fell out through the front of the engine onto the floor. I reached over and picked up those pieces, and I recognized them immediately as part of the high compressor blading deep within inside the engine.
Al Weaver discovers that the pieces that fell from the engine were broken blades from the compressor. Jet engines need pressurized air for combustion. 2 separate compressors inside the engine are made up of dozens of steel blades. The rapidly spinning blades force air to the back of the engine. The pressurized air is ignited in the combustion chamber, creating thrust. Weaver notices that the compressor blades from Flight 242 are badly bent or fatigued. The way they're bent tells him they were damaged in the air, not when the plane hit the ground.
And we know that that fatiguing and the type of fatigue that we could observe with our eye is caused by the repetitive surging of the engine over and over.
A surge occurs when the airflow through an engine gets interrupted. Pressure builds up between the compressors instead of behind them. Without the back pressure, air from the combustion chamber moves to the front of the engine. The engine briefly loses power. Next, investigators need to find out if the repetitive surging was caused by the engines inhaling massive amounts of rain. When an engine ingests rain, it has to convert it into a gas before it can pump it out as exhaust. That process uses energy and slows down the engines. Investigators conclude that with so much rain to convert, the engines couldn't maintain enough power to run the generators. That's what caused the first power outage. But it doesn't explain why the engines failed completely. Al Weaver wants to know if the sheer volume of rain the engines were forced to ingest could have caused their failure. The same engine model that powered Southern Airways 242 is run with up to 14% water to air.
Okay, engines at 3/4 throttle. Let's begin.
Investigators ultimately throw monsoon-level rains against the engine. They run it from idle up to full throttle.
Okay, that's it. Shut it down.
The rain was not enough to cause the kind of surge that tore the engines on Flight 242 to pieces.
Thanks very much, gentlemen.
And the engine operated normally, no abnormalities. So our judgment was we could not conceive of a rainstorm that would put more water in. So we knew we were going in the wrong direction with more water.
The water ingestion test points investigators to another suspect.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
Hail. People who survived the crash describe seeing hail the size of baseballs. It was powerful enough to break the plane's 3.5 centimeter thick windshield. Al Weaver discovers significant hail damage on both of the plane's engine cowlings.
Starting at the front of the engine, we noted that the inlet cowl and the center body that streamlines the airflow going into the engine, which are parts of the aircraft structure and made out of aluminum, were all dented from both engines. And that led us to suspect that the existence of the hail might have been a significant contributor.
Weaver knows that it would take a powerful force to damage the hard metal compressor blades.
We knew from the examination mechanically of the engines that the hail itself did not cause any damage to the engine. It only dented the outside of the covering over the engine.
Heavy precipitation and a damaged cowling could have interrupted the engine's airflow and caused a surge. But one surge shouldn't tear an engine apart. Weaver suspects that massive pieces of hail may have clogged a vital outlet in the plane's engines: the bleed valves. When pressure builds between the two compressors, bleed valves should open automatically to release that pressure and clear the surge. If the bleed valves were blocked, the engines would have continued to surge over and over again.
Once the engine began to surge, the action that the pilot should have taken was to pull the throttles back to clear the surge.
Al Weaver turns to the cockpit voice recorder and discovers that the circumstances may have caused the crew to do the exact opposite.
Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
We're trying to get it up there.
Weaver learns that the crew was asked to climb while in the heart of the storm.
Maintain 15,000, if you understand me.
Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
In order to climb, the captain had to increase thrust to his engines, which would have made matters worse.
But if the surge was not cleared and allowed to continue, then the engine would simply break itself internally.
We're trying to get it up there.
Advancing the throttles would only worsen the situation.
With its bleed cavities blocked by hail, pressure built up inside the engines, bending the compressor blades until they shattered.
Left engine won't spool.
Our left engine just cut out.
And once the blades broke in the compressor, then the engine has no hope of ever working again.
Investigators now understand how the pilots misread the storm and how their engines failed as a result of it. But they don't know why the pilots weren't warned that there was such a severe storm in their path.
Who's got the landing?
Not me. Is the captain?
Ignition, sir.
As the pilots prepared to depart Huntsville, they did have a weather report from Southern Airways, but the information was already hours old.
Looks like you guys got a good one coming.
Southern Airways dispatch did not have updated information. They didn't subscribe to the National Weather Service's update system. They did have a subscription to a service that required them to dial up and receive the information. When the dispatcher called the phone number to get the updated information, it was busy and never pursued it, and was not able to provide any kind of update information to the crew of 242.
Southern Airways 242, I'm painting a line of weather which appears to be moderate to possibly heavy precipitation, starting about 5 miles ahead.
Could Huntsville have provided better weather information? Absolutely. But in the course of doing their job, they provided localized weather information about an intense thunderstorm or rain shower that was moving over the airport. They were only responsible really for about 40 nautical miles. What the crew of Flight 242 was looking at was well beyond 40 miles.
With little information on the storm and having misread their weather radar, Bill McKenzie and Lyman Keel flew blindly into massive thunderheads. The heavy rain and hail crippled their engines. The crew decided that their only option was an emergency landing.
We lost both engines. How about getting to Becker to the nearest place?
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100.
Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
When investigators analyze the flight path of Southern Airways 242, they discover one more deadly oversight.
From the time the crew realized that they had no engine power till the time of touchdown was about 9 minutes. So in looking at the critical decision making, they had about 7 minutes of solid critical decision making before they were committed to that emergency landing on the highway.
Get us a vector to a clear area, Atlanta.
After the engines failed, the pilots made a 180-degree turn towards the west, looking for an escape from the storm. That takes them directly away from Dobbins Air Force Base. The turn takes the pilots out of the hailstorm, but leaves them further away from a runway. They also lose minutes of valuable flying time. Only once the pilots escape the hailstorm do they turn again towards Dobbins.
Is there an airport between our position and Dobbins?
Southern 242, no, sir. Closest airport is Dobbins.
Had they maintained that course to Dobbins, rather than make the turns or try to find another airport, they probably would have had a better success rate and definitely a better survival rate.
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100.
Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
By the time McKenzie received the instructions, Southern Airways 242 had been flying away from Dobbins for too long. The plane was simply too far and flying too low to make it there.
Declare an emergency, Bill.
But there was one last missed opportunity to save Flight 242. Investigators learned that just as McKenzie and Keel were directed towards Dobbins Air Force Base, they were right above another runway. Cornelius Moore Airport.
I thought we would land at Cornelius Moore Airport because I was familiar with that airport. I had flown many times in our airplane back and forth between Decatur and Atlanta.
Investigators learned that Cornelius Moore was just out of range of radar at Atlanta Approach Control. They didn't know it existed. They could not direct Southern Airways 242 there because they couldn't see it on their screens.
When I learned that the controllers in Atlanta didn't know about the Cornelius Moore Airport in Cartersville, I was upset because we went within, I think, 3 or 4 miles of that airport, had a 4,000-foot runway, and even though some of the controllers thought it was too short, it sure would have been better than that highway we landed on.
I was very, very angry. That's such a futile reaction. You know, it was such a waste of life that I was sad.
The NTSB investigation concludes that the catastrophic failure of the turbofan engines and the failure to convey sufficient information on the storm to the pilots are the causes of the crash of Southern Airways 242. The NTSB acts immediately. It issues a recommendation that weather radar systems aboard planes and in air traffic control centers be upgraded to better portray weather systems.
In today's commercial aircraft, pilots have available to them color weather radar. It's radar that will depict in various color bands the intensity of the precipitation.
The crash of Southern Airways 242 also leads to a better understanding of how engines should be managed in heavy precipitation.
We once again reaffirmed to the pilots the importance not to allow the engine to continue operation in continual surging. If there is a surge condition for any reason, you should clear the surge, because if you didn't clear the surge and allowed it to operate, it would break eventually.
In every air crash, investigators try to determine whether or not the accident was survivable.
When you look at the survivability in an aircraft accident, you can definitively say that the design of the seat contributed to the survival factors aspects. But the statistics that bear out whether sitting in the front of the airplane is safer, the middle of the airplane is safer, or the back of the airplane is safer don't exist. In this particular instance, a surviving passenger, Don Foster, was quick thinking. He put a leather jacket over his head and used a pillow as a buffer between the seat in front of him and his face. That probably saved his life from the standpoint that it minimized any injuries he would have suffered.
In fact, the NTSB believes that if flight attendants had distributed blankets and pillows to the passengers, there would have been fewer injuries as a result of the crash.
We learned from every airplane crash. We learned from this one. We learned that the communication broke down within the FAA, within Southern Airways, even within the cockpit of that DC-9. What we didn't ultimately learn, though, is the most important lesson, and that is awesome respect for Mother Nature and what Mother Nature can do.
30 years have passed since Southern Airways 242 crashed through the small community of New Hope, Georgia. Every 10 years since the crash, survivors of the tragedy gather at a church in New Hope. They remember those that were lost and help one another cope with the tragedy. It's one of the longest-running survivors group of its kind.
I want to welcome you to this service today in remembering April the 4th, 1977, when the Southern Airways Flight 242 crashed here in the New Hope community.
Earl D. Johnson. Lyman Keel, Jr. William Wade McKenzie.
Earl C. Griffin, Jr.
After the crash, I had a hard time understanding how I managed to survive. And after a couple of months, I quit worrying about it. I felt like I had a second shot at it. I felt like that family was more important, having fun was more important.
It took a pretty deep toll on our family, my mother and my father especially. They lost 2 of their children and all their grandchildren all at one time.
And I can still, to this day, I can smell the odors, and I can hear the sounds, and I can see those people. So many things will bring back those smallest memories. And every time it's triggered, the emotions come back. You don't want them to, you don't ask for them, but you can't stop them.
I believe it's important for the survivors to get together so that they can share their experiences, know that there are other people that went through the same feelings that they did.
I mean, I've had a great life because of this, in a way. That makes no sense, but it's changed me for the better. I think I've done better, had a better life because of how I grew from that.
May this service do honor to these dear loved ones, and may it bring comfort and peace to we who remain.